Thank you very much, Kim. And uh, let me just say, it's such a great pleasure to be with you all. And this has been extremely stimulating conversation. Let me say first that the challenges that we face in Nigeria, just as I think Nasir has already alluded to, of course, massive, given the population. But just to the point that Asim made, perhaps we have the advantage of being able to manage ourselves or our own problems in smaller measure, or by dividing up, as it were, the country. Of course, we run a federation, which means that Nasir could do some very excellent work up there in Kaduna. Lagos could do some excellent work. Ogun State could do some excellent work. But of course, by the very nature of these, by the very nature of this pandemic, it also means that you run the risk of everything going south if some state isn't doing as well as it ought. So I think, in the end, we have that advantage, that we're able to almost isolate, as it were, responses, and even look at best practices across the various states and try and ramp up wherever we find that there are deficiencies. But that's just to the point that Asim made. I'd just like to ask a few questions. I really would hate to pass up the opportunity of so many very bright minds here, not to ask questions and to waste the time talking or making my own views known. Let me ask Amandla, if I could get some free advice from McKinsey on this point. I wonder what you think, about some of the current conversation going on between African ministers of finance, the economic community the ECA, on this whole question of converting sovereign commercial debt to new concessional paper, backed up, or guaranteed, as it were, by multilaterals. Some have suggested that perhaps we could ask some of the G7 countries to use their SDR rights in the IMF to support this whole effort. And because, of course, one of the major problems we have at the moment is the point that you made, debt servicing and spending so much resources on debt servicing at a time when we can, really hardly afford to run medical care and take care of the other business that we need to do. So I'd like to ask what your views are on that. The other question that I'd like to ask is to Ahmed. I hope Ahmed is still there. Mubarak, Professor Mubarak, I hope he's still there. Right, I'd like to ask him, because, okay, we've done a lot on conditional transfers, especially within the context of our social investment policies. But we're now looking at how to possibly enlarge the scope of that and do more. Now, we're looking beyond using cash transfers as it were, some incentive for staying at home. We're trying to see whether this can address some of the problems of, some of the increasing problems of poverty that we're likely to find now, given just the disruptions, aside from the lockdown. Even just the disruptions to the economy have meant, as you pointed out, that the daily paid worker simply has no means of working, and so many people have been laid off. So what do you think about cash transfers? I mean, to what extent do you think that these are useful in stimulating the economy, but more importantly, in taking people out of poverty? And then one last question, and this is the question, and anyone who could answer this. Now, we've been talking a lot about targeting small businesses, target support for small businesses, target support for MSMEs and all of that. Now, given our own circumstances, I mean, I just, I'm enthralled by what we see in some of the countries, especially in the West, where because there is some, reasonable data about all of the MSMEs that are available, they're able to target directly. What do we do? I mean, here we have loads of one-man businesses. The informal sector is truly informal, and when you say 80% informal, that is a massive part of the economy. How do you target those small businesses? Is it the small loans, or are we looking at something more creative? And if there is something more creative, I certainly would like to know.
So, Mr. Vice President, let me accept this offer to give you free advice with an answer that I would need more analysis to give you a specific answer for Nigeria. And so I'll reach out for the opportunity to do that further. I think my, not being a financial economist, what I think is fantastic about having the conversation about convertible debt is it gets us thinking about very creative ways outside of traditional instruments we've used in this fiscal monetary space to address the challenges that we're in. So I think we need to think about things like convertible debt, debt swaps, even when we get further down away from sovereign debt into private debt. I think we need to also understand what it means, right? That we are forestalling payments. We're not getting debt relief, right? And some of our, we've successfully negotiated some debt relief, not just for highly indebted poor countries, but others. I think we should see these conversations as an opportunity to think about fundamentally restructuring our relationship with debt. So we're forestalling payments, but our debt to GDP ratios continue to be unsustainable given the amount of servicing that we're doing. So it's not just about the instruments, but really how we would restructure these conversations going forward. And so I personally am really excited for the opportunity for our governments to do that, one. I think the second thing that conversations like these convertible swaps are doing, the power is really in trying to have this conversation at a Pan-African level. And so our envoys that have been nominated by the AU are showing the power already of going as a unified voice. So the strength of our economies as 54 is a very different bargaining negotiation you go into, as opposed to as ECOWAS or as ECA or as SADC. And so I think that opportunity is one that we can't wait on. The third opportunity, though, that I think we have in thinking about a question like this is how we consider actual domestic savings and trying to, again, it's part of restructuring how we think about debt, but are there opportunities for us to change our marginal propensity to consume, which is super high right now? This is actually something I learned in Asim Khwaja's class. But the marginal propensity to consume in China is very, very low, which is why savings and domestic savings rates in China are very high. So when you think about stimulating your economy, you can do it from a domestic pool of money. And now that we're potentially pegging our currencies to the RMB across our economies, it's actually really helpful to think about building capacity domestically to save. And so I think that this question of converting those bonds gives us an opportunity to do that thinking and really do it at a Pan-African level, because that's, I think, how we make it different than times we've entered negotiations with global parties previously.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Vice President, for that question. The question about conditional cash transfers, I think cash transfers are absolutely necessary, right? Whether they should be, the details that you have to figure out are things like, should they be conditional, and should that be in cash or in kind, right? How should the delivery mode be? Yeah. I'll come back to that, but first I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of getting cash transfers out, or any kind of transfers out, even if you want to. So the first part of the mechanics is that we need to figure out how to target. So how do we identify the people who are currently most at need? So here I want to talk about 3 different objectives that the government might have. So one is that you want to target the poor, people who are most desperate. And the reason is, if they're going hungry, they're not going to be able to follow your guidelines, right? So that's one thing. Second, we might want to identify people who are hurting the most. What are the occupations that are facing the largest shocks? So here I would point out, as the president of Ghana earlier did, day wage laborers, migrant workers. And why is it that we care about migrant workers? These are the people who might also impose the largest negative public health externalities, because they move around for work, right? And they can spread the disease. So now the question is, are there any good ways for us to identify people who just face a larger shock? So earlier in my presentation, before you joined, Mr. Vice President, I talked about, you know, some types of agricultural laborers that face very, very large shocks that we can identify from the data. Now, how do you go about identifying those occupations? So here, you know, so I'm working on this problem in Bangladesh, and neither the government nor researchers have great information on this. And the entity that has the best information that we can make use of is the mobile service providers, because it's the one technology that now 150 million people in my country, in Bangladesh, now carry around. So there are now mechanisms for us to maybe merge sort of old household survey data of the type that has been collected around Nigeria, around Bangladesh, with mobile service usage patterns. And it won't surprise you to learn that poor people who are suffering, they use the mobile phones differently than we do. So you can use machine learning, artificial intelligence, in order to pick up subtle patterns in their mobile phone usage that distinguishes them from us. And once you have that machine learning algorithm developed, then you can apply it countrywide and say, okay, let's identify the people who are using their phones this way. And let's see if we can send them an SMS and identify them quickly. And then I'll say one other thing about data. If you could go down 2 more slides. I think this is a case where this is a map of Bangladesh and the different districts and sub-districts. So this is also a case where we need to figure out how to join forces between research, data, cell phone providers, government data systems, in order to spatially target support where it's most needed, right? So the map I'm showing here, the darker colors, just happen to be data from the government systems on who received migration permits. So what is this data useful for? I can figure out what are the sub-districts within Bangladesh that had lots of migrants who were traveling to Italy or Spain, like countries that were most affected and where our disease came from, right? Since I know their addresses, I can target that back to, oh, these are the sub-districts where the disease is most likely present and most likely to be growing. So using like indirect inferences like this in the absence of direct nationwide testing, as Amanla pointed out, that in Africa and Asia, we don't have widespread testing. We need to figure out how to cleverly make use of these types of indirect data. And one of the things I will point out here is that while we're doing this work in Bangladesh, we are also trying to build teams to do this in various African countries as well. So I would be very happy to connect and help in whatever way we can.
For the third question, who would like to address the third question? Can I throw it open?
Hakeem, I can comment on it, something I've thought about. I think the best way to support SMEs is by basically allowing them to work. I'm going to say something controversial. If we do any subsidy mechanism, it'll always be imperfect. And I think what we need to think about it is how do you open up work opportunities for them, which are safe in the COVID world. And the way you should think about that is have small producers. Small production is very safe, actually. You just need the transaction between buyer and seller to happen safely. So you should think of small producers being connected to like online delivery mechanisms. I think that's probably the best.